Today, with the release of Resident Evil 4 Remake, I thought it would be fun to have a look at the entire timeline of Resident Evil. We'll have a look at where everything actually places and what important things happen within each game to the overarching storyline of Resident Evil. As you can imagine, due to the length of the video, we're going to be doing quick views at every one of the games, which means we're going to be missing a lot of key elements. But if you guys enjoyed this video, I thought it would be a lot more effective and fun to look at each individual character's entire lifespan in our next series if we continue with Resident Evil. So, kicking it off from the top, in chronological order, we have Resident Evil 0, taking place in July 1998. This was set up as a sequel to the original game to give us more backstory on Rebecca Chambers, Albert Wesker, William Birkin, and basically the setup for Resident Evil 1. It's one of those sequel/prequel game situations. Rebecca was a part of the original team that had arrived and went missing, and this basically just sets everything up. Resident Evil 1, the official game that kicked off the entire franchise, shortly takes place in the same month in 1998. This kicked off the franchise with its haunted house location telling us the story of Chris and Jill being sent in to find their missing teammates. This led them down a path of discovering the true motivations of Umbrella, Wesker, and Birkin. This set up the grandiose mythos by explaining Umbrella was attempting to create bioweapons with their viruses. They used their resources to take control of Raccoon City and even led to the reveal that Wesker was a double agent working for Umbrella. This was also the reveal of the T-virus, which created the basic zombie-like bioweapons. Next up, we have Resident Evil 2 and 3. They both take place in September of 1998. I lumped them together because 3 takes place before and after 2, with the opening of 3 happening before 2 and the ending happening after 2. Resident Evil 2 follows Leon and Claire as they have just arrived at Raccoon City. In this game, they're dealing with the massive breakout, basically the fallout from Resident Evil 1. In here, we get to see a lot of the T-virus variations for the first time, things such as lickers. And we get to further dive into how much control Umbrella has over the city of Raccoon City. We discover that they had their hands in a lot of pots, controlling the police force, the mayors, the city works, and all kinds of stuff. Overall, this is mine and a lot of Resident Evil fans' favorite game in the franchise. But moving forward, we also have 3, which, like I said, takes place during this. 3 follows up on Jill Valentine, showing us where she went after the events of Resident Evil 1. At the time, this just leaves us with the mystery of Chris missing. In Jill's game, we see that one of the strands of the T-virus can actually make creations like Mr. X. This game mostly shows us that Raccoon City gets destroyed to cover up the evidence from Resident Evil 1 and the outbreak of the city. Because up until this time, with 4 games under their belt officially, the storyline basically is that there is an evil corporation creating bioweapons that happen to look like zombies and a few other weird monsters, and they happen to be doing it in Raccoon City, and now they need to destroy all evidence that this even happened while people escape. The next game in chronological storyline order takes place in November of 1998, Resident Evil Survivor. This one just kind of reveals that Umbrella is in more locations than Raccoon City. It's a light gun game that I remember the cover of, and that's about it. Following that, we have Code Veronica, which takes place in December of 1998. This game sets up the return of Chris Redfield and Claire, as Chris is basically looking for where Claire ended up, and he ends up finding Wesker after Wesker betrayed Chris and his team. As much fun as this game is, it really just showed more of a dynamic between Chris, Wesker, and Claire. And we also see that Wesker is beginning to gain powers by injecting himself with the viruses, and he stole some of the bodies of the other individuals in this storyline for further research. Next up, we have Resident Evil DARKSIDE Chronicles, basically just showing us what Leon has been up to following the events of the game. Apparently, he went after a drug lord in South America where he discovers that it's overrun by zombies conveniently, because it's a Resident Evil game. Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles is another light gun shooter game taking place around February of 2003. This is mostly just a recap game, but the ending apparently shows Wesker getting files for the US government to use against Umbrella in a legal battle, which is one of the key elements that's going to set up the direction of Umbrella and the BSAA, but we'll get to that. Resident Evil 4 picks back up in the main story progression taking place in 2004. Honestly, as much as people love this game, it really has nothing to do with the greater Resident Evil lore other than showing Leon saving Ashley and developing their character development. The virus in this one is actually called the Las Plagas virus, which isn't connected to Umbrella or anything else. The remakes retconned Nemesis to have been altered by Las Plagas in order to link it into the timeline a little bit better, but that's about it and how it actually links to the main story. Overall, this was kind of treated like a pseudo-soft reboot. New virus, new enemies, new location. Resident Evil Revelations happens next in the same time period, 2004 and 2005. This was another attempt at expanding the concepts and ideas of Resident Evil beyond a zombie virus. This one expands the BSAA concepts that are introduced in Resident Evil 5, which we're going to get to. BSAA is the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance. Basically, with all of these viruses now popping up all over the world, they decided that they needed to make a task force in order to handle them. Chris and Jill are actually a part of this task force. In this spin-off game, we also discovered the T-Abyss virus, but overall, it's pretty much a cool game set on a boat. It originally came out on the 3DS, but it's got some re-releases, and it's one of my favorite side games in the franchise. Resident Evil 5 officially happens next, and it takes place in a split timeline of 2006 and 2009. This one is when action took more of the forefront of Resident Evil, as Chris is chasing down a bioterrorist named Ricardo Irving. He discovers the company that created BSAA, Tricell, is actually doing all of this to get their hands on the viruses and further Umbrella's research. We also find out that Wesker is actually another experiment trying to wipe out humanity. That's how he gets superpowers, by injecting himself with the various strands of the virus. This storyline basically resolves with the ending of Wesker supposedly, as he's supposedly dead, and the resolution of the viruses. Next up, we have Resident Evil Revelations 2. It happens around 2011 and basically shows us where Claire has been this whole time, as she went missing ever since Code Veronica. I actually didn't get to play this one, but I read through its wiki entry and it doesn't seem to add anything of major importance to the overall storyline other than explaining where Claire has been this whole time. Umbrella Corp happens next. It's a Resident Evil tactical shooter. It happens in 2012, and the only major takeaway is that Umbrella has been rebuilt to make amends for what earlier Umbrella did. Resident Evil 6 is next, taking place over 2012 and 2013. This one basically tried to wrap up a lot of loose plot threads and things left by the series up to this point by giving us 3 different storylines. But overall, here's what you really need to know. Chris gets put in charge of a new BSAA group. A lot of them end up dying. He's very upset about that, but ends up overcoming it at the end of this and being put in charge of yet another BSAA group. Leon Kennedy and Sherry Birkin are both still around and kicking. Ada Wong is still around doing top secret Ada stuff. And we're also introduced to Jake Mueller, who, as it turns out, is the son of Wesker. But he's a good guy, so it's okay, and he joins the core cast. In terms of bigger effects in the Resident Evil universe, this game introduced the C virus, which was the core plot of all 3 storylines, trying to stop the C virus. This one was a baffling virus, as it was Capcom's excuse to do anything. It can revive the dead, it can turn living characters into monsters. It can literally do anything you want it to do, and it does. But it was also seemingly destroyed at the end of 6, kind of wrapping up the virus plot lines, along with Chris going on a new group, Leon Kennedy and Sherry Birkin being around, Ada doing Ada stuff, and Jake joining up with BSAA, and they give him a brand new name. This is when things take a bit of a turn. Resident Evil 7 is the first oddball. Taking place in 2017, it does nothing but hint at the rest of the series' mythos. Things like Umbrella, BSAA, and Chris Redfield make appearances and are referenced, but that's about it. As for what happens here, Ethan Winters, the new protagonist, is looking for his wife Mia. This leads him to a backwater location where there's a new mold-type virus thing, which is basically just the new virus, and we'll explain that a little bit better in a second. Resident Evil Village continues the storyline, taking place in 2021. Both of these games resolve with new viruses and a new star, Ethan's daughter Rose. So basically there's the Megamycete, which is an ancient organism that is the core of a giant mold colony. It caused the mold to reach out, and anything that it touched would become affected and changed and altered. Miranda saw Rose and Ethan as anomalies because they had messed with the mold in 7 and they lived. As Miranda messed with the mold further, it consumed the nearby village, which is how it all got weird and twisted and seemingly created werewolves, vampires, and stuff. That's kind of the important bits, because at the ending of all of this, the mold virus was destroyed, and Rose ends up joining up with the BSAA as their newest member, but seemingly having weird mold powers that we don't have a lot of explanation on just yet. And that's the important bits on this one, because at the ending, it was seemingly destroyed except for a small portion of the mold that the BSAA recovered, and the inclusion of Rose as a main cast member now. Rose is a bit of an anomaly as well, because she seemingly has mold-based powers, but we don't know how they work or anything really beyond like a superficial level of what they are and what they do. This brings us up to date on the overarching storyline of Resident Evil. Obviously, there's a ton that I had to gloss over from the individual games and big things that happen to each individual character, But my goal here was to give you the overarching storyline as to where all the viruses and everything are at this point, because this game is crazy. Like I said at the beginning, if you're interested, I can dive into each character individually and explain everything that they did. But before we close out, let's list the games that are not considered canon before one of you assume that I forgot it. Resident Evil Survivor 2 is just listed as redoing Code Veronica as a light gun game. Resident Evil Gaiden is basically a Game Boy Color game starring Leon. I couldn't find anything interesting in it that would have adapted to the main storyline and explained anything major, but this one basically explains where Barry went. Resident Evil Dead Aim is almost listed nowhere as important. It has unique characters, namely this character named Bruce. It's set 4 years after Resident Evil 2 and stars Bruce, but it never showed up again, so I don't think it pertains to the main overarching storyline at all or reveals anything important to the overarching storyline. Resident Evil Outbreak 1 and 2. I played these as a kid and thought they were the coolest thing ever, but it's just about the survivors in Raccoon City and their attempts to get out during Resident Evil 2 and 3. Resident Evil Deadly Silence is a remake of the original game for DS. Resident Evil Mercenaries 3D is a 3DS game that is just a horde mode style game. No plot as far as I can remember. Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City is so out of canon that it was literally one of its selling points. Kill key characters like Leon. Just have fun with what-if adventures. Resident Evil Resistance was Capcom's attempt to make a 4v1 horror game. It didn't even last a full year before being shut down, and since it doesn't exist anymore, I can't find if there are any story beats, but I don't think it had any. Resident Evil Reverse is their new attempt to tap into the competitive market. I have not heard good things, and honestly I haven't tried it, but from what I gather it has no story. And that's everything that I could find. Now, some of you are probably going to state, what about the CG movies, Benny? The CG movies are considered canon, but overall they don't do much other than add to the world building. Starting with Degeneration, which came out in 2008, it basically sets up Tricell as an in-world presence before Resident Evil 5, and kind of explains a little bit as to why Chris was in Africa. The next one was Damnation, which came out in 2012. It takes place between Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6, and it really doesn't do anything other than give another situation for Leon to go and stop zombies. Vendetta came out in 2017, which was touted as being the return of Rebecca Chambers, since nobody had seen her since Resident Evil 0. Then we have Infinite Darkness, which was a Netflix thing, I believe, but it just follows more of Leon and Claire's adventures, but it doesn't add anything to the overarching lore. And then we have a new one that is coming out, Death Island, but obviously, it's not out yet. I can't tell you if it adds anything to the overarching plot and narrative of Resident Evil. The live-action movies are, in fact, their own timeline, and if you tried to put those into this timeline, you would break your brain. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below, and don't forget to let me know what character you want me to cover first if you want me to continue talking about Resident Evil. Thank you guys so much for your support. I just love organizing all these video games, and I started doing this video because I was just trying to remember everything in Resident Evil 4, and as I started outlining how each game mattered to the overarching plot, I realized I accidentally wrote a script up. And so we made a video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll be back very soon with a lot more Assassin's Creed, some Final Fantasy XIV storylines, and some Sonic. I've got a lot. Go to the community tab over here. I've got a lot of things announced over there that I've been working on. I've gotten a little overzealous. There's a lot of projects I'm working on.